Hello, everyone, and welcome to what I know is going to be a wonderful webinar. My name is Sandra Husel, and I am the admissions director at Eaton Arrowsmith. Very pleased to have been part of our wonderful organization for almost 20 years now. And at this time, I have the great pleasure of introducing Howard Eaton, our director at Eaton Arrowsmith, who in conjunction with Dr. Brad Hale will be presenting Educational Neuroscience Applied to Classroom Instruction, the Teaching Brain Literacy Movement. So I'm thrilled to have them both with us today, and we'll get started. I'll turn it over to you, Howard.
Great, thank you, Sandra. I am absolutely excited to have Dr. James Hale here. I know him as Brad, so I think Brad's gonna let me use that name, but certainly he's known by many students, graduate students, undergraduate students as Dr. Hale. And I first met Dr. Hale at the University of Calgary almost maybe more than 10 years ago when I went to visit him with Barbara Arrowsmith Young to discuss research. And Barbara Arrowsmith Young's work, pioneering work in educational neuroscience. I heard of Dr. Hale's work at the University of Calgary. He was involved in educational neuroscience. He was a professor of educational neuroscience at the University of Calgary, well published, both the journal articles and books on neuropsychology. And he was a real influencer. And Barbara and I wanted to meet him. And we were both very impressed with this man and his graduate students that are now still friends of his. And we decided to do some research analysis with him, and he also presented at our conferences that we had in Vancouver. So it was just just a privilege to know him, and it's exciting that he was interested in doing this webinar in teaching brain literacy. And we both have a real passion for trying to get teachers educated in brain science. And we decided, hey, let's do this webinar together. And inform teachers, inform parents, inform adults who might want to know more about brain literacy. And this is what he's doing now. He has an organization in Bellingham called the Center for Teaching Brain Literacy, and that has become his purpose and vision in life. Now, I don't see his video feed. I'm hoping he's still there. Brad, are you still with us?
Hello.
There you are. You got your video on? There he is. All right. Hey. So yes. So I'll leave you at it there, Brad, as you want to help us move through your slide deck, and we look forward to any questions people have in terms of the presentation. And again, thank you, Brad, for being part of this. It's a real pleasure.
Well, I'm honored to be here. You know, like Howard was talking many years ago, my team at Calgary met with them, and you know, what a fantastic group of people, very sharp and knowledgeable, and we had candid discussion. And what I kind of emphasized during that talk, it was really an all-day thing. We met and collaborated, was science should guide practice. And here we are 10 years later, or however long it's been, with Eaton Arrowsmith actually having some science that shows it's an effective approach. We'll hear about that next week. Next week's all about intervention. So this week is more about understanding the brain and how it works in relation to academic and psychosocial functioning. So let's go ahead and get started. Again, if you have questions, put it in the chat room, and we can go from there. So like Howard mentioned, I'm director of the Center for Teaching Brain Literacy, and he's the founder and director of Eaton Arrowsmith. So we're very directed here. Anyway, let's go ahead and get going. And why do we need brain literacy? You know, a lot of people go like, hey, you know, my job's just fine without it. But, you know, let's look at some of the issues here. One of the things that is pretty critical is understanding diversity in our classrooms. And, I find it, I always find it fascinating how living here in the Pacific Northwest, where we are very, let's say, value diversity, nobody likes to talk about cognitive diversity. And that's unfortunate because it's a diverse cognitive world out there too. And what I usually say is, if you don't believe you have any weaknesses in addition to your strengths, you got one, it's called denial. We all have weaknesses, we all have strengths. And I'm going to refer back to that over and over throughout this talk. So what are some of the issues? Every time I go to a live conference, I ask people to raise their hands if they've heard of multiple intelligences. And yes, everybody has. That seems to be part of standard educational curriculum for some time. Unfortunately, multiple intelligences has what I call a humanistic cachet. It really is about valuing the individual student you're working with, and that is cool. However, when it comes to research or pragmatic value, we're much more limited there. I was amazed when I did research on this a few years ago about how little research there was done on multiple intelligences. But it's very popular, isn't it? And you've all heard of it. So unfortunately, part of the problem too is that teachers don't get trained in applying science to instruction. Just kind of like how I started my talk out a few minutes ago. If you haven't seen it already, get Hattie's book, Visible Learning. It is a meta-analysis of meta-analyses. And what does that mean? It's got hundreds of studies in it that shows what are effective teaching approaches. Another problem we run into is, when I was in my teacher training, I was a teacher before I became a psychologist and a neuropsychologist. And very little, we had one class that I remember that dealt with exceptionality. And, we'd have one lecture on learning disabilities and one lecture on ADHD and one lecture. And I didn't know anything about helping kids with disabilities after my master's degree. And I thought, oh my gosh, now I'm out here trying to practice in the schools. I taught 7th and 8th grade, cross-categorical, so I had different disabilities in my classroom. It was a resource classroom. And whenever they didn't respond to my instruction or my interventions, I said it was hormones. That's all there was. 7th and 8th grade. Anyway, so they don't get trained about the reading problems kids have or the math problems kids have. And so they often use a trial and error approach. What often happens is after the evaluation is done, the multidisciplinary team evaluation is done, they're often using a trial and error approach to try to understand that. Where does that psychology report go? In the kid's file, in the drawer. And there's no connection between how a kid learns, which is what the psychologist should be telling people, and actual learning in the classroom. And so there's a big disconnect here with that approach. And one of the things I would argue is it really fair to kids to try a phonics approach that everybody else in the school does with a reading disability when the kid has a working memory problem interfering with comprehension? I mean, we do this all the time where we spend, 10 grand or 20 grand on this reading package. And what if it doesn't cover the kid's disability area? I mean, we really need to think more flexibly about that. Now, what's positive is that teachers really do want to serve kids with diverse needs in their classroom, but all the survey research that's been done on that really says teachers feel ill-prepared to do what they're asked to do in the classroom. And it's pretty hard to do if you got a classroom full of 30 kids, right? Anyway, let's move on to the next slide. And this is what often people do when you bring up brain literacy or neuroscience, or, it's all just, we don't know what that brain does. It's, it's all a black box. There's nothing further from the truth. Next slide. So here's the reality that we need to deal with today. The problem: teaching changes children's brains. Yes, as an educator or as a psychologist or an allied health professional, your job is to change brains. It's not your elbow that does the thinking, it's up here. And no, it's not a blank slate. You might have heard of John Locke and tabula rasa and all this. No, the brain changes and adjusts to the environment. On the other hand, educational neuroscience knows about brain function, but when I talk to a lot of neuroscientists about this stuff, they go like, what? You want to teach teachers how the brain works? Why would you want to do that? Adopt my intervention program instead. Carve out 45 minutes in your day to do my intervention program and kids will get better. And that's, it does work for some. And I know Arrowsmith has actually looked at some of that in relation to achievement. So we shouldn't be naysayers about it, but we should also be trying to get educators to understand brain function in their classrooms, in how they're thinking about kids and how the kids are thinking in response to instruction. And that's what I call the brain literacy solution. Next slide, please. So this is, this is not a full training program. I get it. I always laugh when people say, we want an hour where you teach us all about the brain and what to do for intervention and, how we're going to adjust what we do and all this in an hour. Well, it really is, at least to do this well, at least 24 hours of instruction. But one of the things I've done over the years is I've collected data on people's response to the training. And here's some of the things that have been said over the years. I can't believe we didn't learn about this in school. This should have been in every class we had. And then another one, what you're telling us is our job is to change kids' brains. That's pretty awesome and scary too. Because what if you do the wrong thing and you change a kid's brain for not so much better, or they don't get better? And that happens to a lot with our special education population, is that a lot of these kids, special education is lifelong, and it shouldn't be. Especially kids with high incidence disorders or problems, we should be able to get them out of special education if we're doing the right instruction and intervention. That whole idea that learning disabilities is lifelong, I'm sorry, folks, that's wrong. Neuroscience has rewritten that story, and we can change kids' brains so we normalize brain function. And I will show you slides next week which shows you how we normalize kids' brain functioning as a result of our interventions. The brains change, and we're going to talk about plasticity in a few minutes, quite a bit of highlighting why we can change brains. I want to learn how to help these kids before it's too late, before the kids' brains get wired wrong. Where can I get help on early intervention? And one of the things that I really want to emphasize tonight is that early intervention is key. It really is, because the brain will hardwire itself towards dysfunction if we don't do the right things. Your comments about the different brain areas in reading explain so much of what I see in my kids who struggle. One of the things that's a joy about giving these talks is you see teachers and other educators and psychologists out in the audience and going like, oh, yeah, I've seen that. It's one of the reasons why the people who are behavioral only and response to intervention only folks don't like what the reality is, which is individual differences are important in a classroom. And I was a Skinnerian at one time. I was a radical behaviorist at one time. And then I read what Skinner wrote about individual differences. And, you know, Skinner struggled with it. He actually wrote quite a bit about individual differences and concluded that individual differences were nuisance variables. That's what he called them, is nuisance variables. So kids' brains change based on the curriculum and our instruction. So we've got to figure out how to adjust how we teach. So that's what personalized education is all about. And so how do we adjust what we do on the fly? And that's what brain literacy is all about, is creating that kind of skill set in educators and psychologists and other allied professionals so that they are thinking about the brain all the time. You'd be surprised to read one of my neuropsychological reports, because I do neuropsychological evaluations. I also do forensic evaluation, as well as independent educational evaluations in schools. But there's not brain in there. All I do is talk about kids in my reports. Anybody who's a neuropsych or is trained in brain literacy can read through the lines that I'm talking about the cingulate there, or the corpus callosum. But I don't put those in my reports unless there's a medical condition that's been documented by neurology or some sort of imaging or something like that. Otherwise, I just talk about kids and their function.
Hey, Brad, one of the things too, just to ask you, is, when you teach children about the brain in the classroom and how they can be empowered by knowing that it's plastic, that knowing the brain can change. Has this been part of what you've been teaching teachers as well, as the power it gives a child?
Yeah, and so yeah, I mean, Howard, that's an excellent question, because the ideas, the foundations of this came from when I started asking kids who I was evaluating, what's hard with learning? Why do you struggle with learning? And I could have a kid who's gifted in like fluid reasoning or something like that, an IQ of 130, 140. And 90% of kids say I'm dumb. And that's a tragedy. That's so sad, because you think of how many kids' lives are cut short because they internalize that they're somehow different and somehow, not worthy of a successful life. And all you need to do is look at all the famous people who had disabilities, including myself, and how we made it. Well, I haven't made it, but anyway, the rest of those other guys do. I mean, some of our greatest inventors, Einstein, was an example where a teacher in his classroom when he was a youth, the teacher said to him, "You'll never make anything of yourself." And boy, how that must, we wouldn't do that today, we'd be fired. But how many kids who struggle in an area of learning or behavior or emotions internalize that kind of indirect message that somehow they're insignificant, that they're below their peers. And that's really the sad state of the response to intervention model, in my opinion, is they're just low. LD kids are just low. They're not quite intellectually disabled, they're just low. And they could be brilliant in an area and never realize it because they've internalized that.
When you say response to intervention, for those who may not be familiar with that term, I'm not sure if you're going to go through that in these slides. I didn't see it.
No.
Can you just give a brief description of what you're talking about, response to intervention, just for those who might not know?
Well, there's a camp that's strongly supported by the National Association of School Psychologists, and has been for years, who say that we don't need neuropsychological testing or cognitive testing. We don't need to look at how kids learn. They all learn the same way. And so you just give them more intense instruction to get them better. And, think about that for a minute. Here you got a kid with a working memory problem and they're given Orton Gillingham phonics. And guess what? Their reading comprehension doesn't improve. So they essentially internalize there's something wrong with me when the instruction isn't good.
And I guess response from intervention comes from the educators who really aren't trained in brain science.
No.
Right. Okay.
No. they've read no articles on the brain or brain functioning or response to intervention or that the brain changes.
So it's pretty
Most of
much
them have it.
a scattergun approach, just shoot and hope.
Yeah, just do the best evidence-based approach. But I've been in schools long enough to know the best evidence-based approach is what the administrators decide to pay a fortune for. And then every kid gets the same thing.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd love to say I've seen much more individualization in instruction than I have, but I have to admit, I'm sorry to say, when I was a special ed teacher and I was an intern, my mentor actually used to take the scope and sequence from the book and copy it and paste it into the IEPs. So how individualized is that, right?
Thanks for answering the questions. I'll let you keep going here.
Yeah. Okay, next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about neurodevelopment, because there might be some surprises here. We would all argue that neurodevelopment is pretty appropriate, but let's go on to the next slide and we'll jump into it. One of the people I want to highlight for you is actually Dr. Kim Fitzer is the person who really turned me on to Donald Hebb. And she's a lovely person. She's on the Brain Gain team, or now the Center for Teaching Brain Literacy. Anyway, Donald Hebb, a good Canadian, really came up with some fascinating ideas. He talks about the neurobasis of learning and brain plasticity. Plasticity means it can adjust and adapt to the environment. And what he talks about is how you build pathways, but you also destroy others. One of the common misconceptions is more brain is better. No, actually, guess what disease or disorder has too much brain functioning? That's autism. That's why they're so exhausted all the time. You want to know of a practical application of this stuff? Why are kids with autism so exhausted all the time? It's because their brain is already overfiring, and then you get them exposed to things in the environment that just makes them desynchronized.
And we're seeing that with LD too, with learning disabilities.
Oh, right. Yeah, we'll highlight that a little bit later, but it's more and more what neuroscience has taught us is too much brain functioning is not good. Too little can be a problem as well, but too much is equally a problem. And kids who are really good readers, for instance, they don't even use a tiny portion of their brain when they're reading away, compared to a kid with dyslexia or other types of reading disabilities. I'm going to turn off my phone here. Sorry for that, guys. So the brain is essentially an architect, and that architect is carving and developing those neuronal connections that are erased or modified, much along the lines of actually what Piaget talked about with schema construction, the old notions of assimilation and accommodation. But the genes and environments, it's never an either or. I mean, genes get turned on and turned off. Sure, there's biological loadings for most of our disorders that we run into, but the environment can make that a problematic outcome, or the environment can make that a beneficial one, depending on how we adjust to the person's individual differences. It's a diverse world out there. We need to think about cognitive diversity in what we do. And learning is not a passive process, but an active process. The brain sculpts itself in relation to the environment. And his famous line was, neurons that fire together wire together. And so if we're not using those neurons, guess what? We're not creating new pathways, and we're not destroying dysfunctional pathways. So that process of pruning is what it's called, when they knock out pathways. That's why you don't remember much from when you're a little kid, by the way, is you've rewired all those connections. Anyway, next slide. And I like to bring up some other people you might recognize, like Vygotsky. and Vygotsky talked about the interrelationship of sociocultural, environmental determinants, and biological. It's a good way to think of things. It's not an either or. When I used to teach graduate students all the time, I'd always throw in a case where the kid was just messing around and it wasn't a valid case, and they're trying, oh, is it parietal, temporal, frontal? Sometimes it's the environment, but the environment affects the individual differences, and the individual differences affects the environment. So it's a good way to think about it in a reciprocal way. And you know, the diathesis stress model has been with us in medicine for some time, and that's a great way of thinking with things. Everybody has a genetic loading for everything. The loading might be low, so no matter how bad your environment is, you're still okay. The loading might be very high. Stuff does run in families, and then it doesn't take much in the environment to turn it into a disability, but it goes back and forth. Now, plasticity, which people often think of as a positive thing only, allows for the brain to rewire and compensate, adapting to the dysfunction in the environment. So the brain will adjust, and plasticity exists throughout the lifespan. We get a little, when we get older and curmudgeon-y like me, you know, you don't always want to change, but the brain can change at all ages. And the notion, like with the Kennard principle, that somehow kids were spared the problems of adults because their brains were still developing, really hasn't held up to empirical tests over time, to scientific research over time. But this is an important point that a lot of people don't think about. Plasticity doesn't have a valence. It's not like, oh, always positive, always better. No, the brain will actually work against neurodevelopment, will get worse if we're doing things that are not beneficial to children. A great example, which is one that almost every special ed kid I've ever run into, is they get shorter assignments, fewer items, modified assignments, that kind of thing. That's why they're exhausted all the time, because they never learn anything to automaticity. We'll come back to that later. And I love to bring up Bandura's reciprocal determinism. Why? Because that took me away from being a radical Skinnerian, a radical behaviorist. You know, the reality is cognition, behavior, environment, always important. And, you know, geez, if the kid goes home and plays video games and refuses to do his homework, guess what you do? You say you got to do your homework before you play your video games. You know, it doesn't take a neuropsychological evaluation to figure that out. Next slide, please. So myelination, which is creating of white matter. White matter are like roads and highways in the brain, okay? And that builds speed of thought. And dendritic branches, connections, those continue throughout life. They're much more significant early in life. And, you know, it even starts prenatally. But what happens over time is there's that process I mentioned earlier called pruning. Pruning leads to less gray matter and more white matter. What does that mean? Like with autism, there's just too much going on. So the brain chisels and sculpts away pathways that aren't working or are on overload or not effective in relation to the environment. So the brain's constantly rewiring or reconstructing to create new schemas to replace old ones. And the notion, you know, use it or lose it, it doesn't only apply to sports, it's also related to brain functioning. If you don't use an area of your brain, you won't be, you know, you'll lose that skill. So what is the goal of neurodevelopment? The goal is to maximize good connections in the brain while minimizing or actually destroying, which through pruning, dysfunctional ones. It really is a process of natural selection in which the brain and its genetic determinants is trying to adjust and adapt to the environment, whether the environment is good or bad. And this is why we need to really think carefully about psychopathology or emotional and behavior problems, because if the brain has automatized some of those dysfunctional patterns, the kid may want to change, but really struggles with it because those old patterns are so hardwired into the brain. So hopefully that'll give you a little more patience with some of these kids who say, I don't want to hit other kids anymore. And then they go out and get in a fight on the playground.
Hey, Brad, have you seen any research on ADHD or learning disabilities and myelination studies? Are they looking at the variation in children in myelination? I know that one of the research studies we did at UBC with Dr. Lara Boyd, who you know, Dr. Hale, showed really remarkable ranges in myelination changes over treatment of using Arrowsmith. It was quite startling, where some kids were super myelinators and then some were decreasing myelination, and we thought, oh, is that bad? But you know, what you're saying is that might be a really good thing.
Right. And true. What we find neuropsychologically and neurologically with kids is it's not just lower. You have excesses. And so what the idea is to try to balance the brain, which I'll come back to later. Excellent question. More brain is not better. More efficient brain use is better. Less brain is actually used to do more. You want to know why your kids with learning disabilities are so exhausted at the end of the day? Because they haven't learned anything to automaticity often, because they practice less, they do fewer items, they're excused from exercises and assignments and homework. Homework is one of the best things you could ever do. And I don't know where we got into this whole thing about like homework's a bad thing. No, it means you have to spend more time grading and preparing homework assignments, and that's a drag on teachers. But kids need to practice. You think about anything you're good at, and nobody just picks up a tennis racket, tennis ball, and plays like Dr. Kim Fitzer can. You know, she's a great tennis player. But you don't get good at things by doing less of it. So despite the fact that you say, well, they're too tired, the reason why they're too tired is because they're using too much of their brain to process information because they haven't automatized it. And when you automatize things, you use a lot less brain to be efficient and capable at it. It's just the reality of it. Too much brain functioning is just as bad as too little brain functioning. So the importance of automaticity to free the brain for higher level functioning. The idea, practice makes perfect, is true. So if you've got a kid who's struggling with decoding every time, guess what? Their working memory will be overwhelmed with the decoding, and they won't understand what they're reading. They won't comprehend what they're reading.
I think too, like part of being an educator is to be able to tell children this, the science, the neuroscience of why they need to do this repetition in terms of automaticity, myelination. It gives a reason to children who are wondering, why are you making me do this?
Yeah. And they're saying, I'm going to turn my phone back on so I have a clock. Hold on a minute. If it goes beep, I'll turn that off immediately. Yeah, I mean, that's, you know, you got to give them a reason, and they want to do less work, or they won't even complete the few items you give them. But guess what? They're going to hate school the rest of their life. They're going to struggle with learning the rest of their life because they don't feel successful in anything. And everything's a new gig for them. Every time they go to do that math problem. You know, it's another thing that we've decided, oh, people don't need to learn math facts anymore. Okay? You just need to pull up your multiplication chart and get the answer. But guess what? Then higher level math's harder. Because you don't, when I say 8 times 6 is 48, okay? Did I do any math? No. But I freed up my working memory so I can do math problems. So think about that for a minute, because that's another thing that we're doing. Or giving kids calculators. I can't tell you the number of kids who have math disabilities now because we throw calculators at them, you know, and so they just don't have good number sense.
I know Dr. Norman Deutsch, who wrote The Brain That Changes Itself, was at one of his lectures in Victoria, And he says, teaching sometimes is, repetition and drill, that we've lost that remembering lines of poetry or learning how to tell time on an analog clock. These are things that actually help children free up capacity so they can do higher levels, tasks.
Yeah, so I mean, just think of your own personal stories, right? If you are good at something, you had to practice it a lot to get good at it. All right, next slide, please. All right, so I'm going to give you a real brief. When I do the full workshop on this is a couple hours. But I just want to give you a brief understanding so that when we get into intervention next week and we get into understanding why teaching is changing brain functioning, how the brain actually works. And you'd be surprised that there's some real issues with that. So next slide. I mean, when you look at what you do hear about in education, everybody's heard about multiple intelligences, like I said, in differentiated instruction. The real problem with that is the visual, auditory, kinesthetic, tactile kind of way of thinking of things is not how the brain works. If you say a kid's a visual learner, I'm going to say, what kind of visual learner? Is it more detail oriented? Is it more holistic? So that's not how the brain works. The brain does not work in those sensory modalities. Another one that's very popular is the universal design of learning approach with the recognition, strategic, and effective networks. It's a better model really for brain functioning, but it's still so oversimplified that it's not quite accurate. Instead, I'm going to tell you how the brain works in at least the simple version of it. So next slide. So here's what I call my 3-axis interpretation. Yes, the posterior or the back of the brain is for sensory input and comprehension, and the front of the brain is for executive regulation. A lot of you have heard of executive functions now, but it's like brain boss skills and how do we control ourselves, and also motor output as well. What may be a big change for you guys is the difference between the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. The left hemisphere, more routinized, detailed, local, concordant, convergent thought, crystallized abilities or prior learning. The left brain is what we know and what we learned in life. And many of our learning disabilities have left brain types of problems. The right brain, on the other hand, is more into novel, global, or big picture and isn't concerned with details. The right hemisphere is about making connections in different areas. And if you look at the neuroimaging data, the left hemisphere has a lot of little clusters of neurons, and the right hemisphere is all about connections in different areas of the hemisphere. So there's actually a physiological explanation for it. And then if you look at the superior inferior axis, the cerebellum is not just a motor thing. If people have taken a neuroscience or studied the brain and all, they'll say, oh, it's motor. No, really the cerebellum's a mini brain, and it's what helps us to routinize many skills. And so your job is kind of in learning, if you think about it for a minute, is to move from new or right hemisphere to learned left hemisphere to automatic cerebellar. And if you've learned something to automaticity, 9 times 6 is 54. I don't have to put any resources into that. That's my cerebellum and temporal lobe just firing that off like that. Next slide. And if that's a hard model to think about, and again, you're going to get handouts on these slides, but left hemisphere, old learning and parts and details. Right hemisphere, new learning and whole or big picture. Back of the brain is understanding, front of the brain is doing. And one of the things that some of you may be doing during this talk is taking notes. Think about it for a minute. If you're just listening to me lecture, what part of the brain are you using? The back of the brain, right? You're just listening and comprehending. Maybe a little working memory to kind of keep track of me rambling on. But if you're taking notes, you have to not only understand in the back of the brain, but you have to translate it, which requires frontal lobe activity, and then you have to write it using Exner's area of the brain. So believe me, you are learning twice as much whenever you attend a lecture and take notes. I guarantee you will learn twice as much, because that whole process of listening to me, translating it into your own words, paraphrasing it, and then writing it down, you're using your whole brain instead of half your brain.
Hey, Brad, just to throw something out here that we often hear, that we only use like 10% of our brain. When I look at this, it looks like we're using a lot of our brain at a lot of the time at different times. When you hear someone say, oh, we only use 10% of our brain, is that just an error of analysis there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You use all your brain all the time. Well, again, it depends on how automatic the skill is. What you find is in expert readers, they're just using a little bit of temporal lobe activity. But all of your frontal lobes are always involved in just about everything. And, you got to understand, and you got to do, and you got to, yeah, it's ridiculous to assume that. That again is from the old school where, oh, we have all this cognitive reserve so that we can use new areas of the brain. Yes, you can use new areas of the brain, but you have to create them while breaking down old areas that you're replacing.
I guess the other question too, we had one student from California who had half the brain removed for epilepsy and seemed to be functioning well with just his right hemisphere. So the brain, it seems like a hemisphere can take over a lot of different capacities.
Yeah. What often happens, unfortunately, with that is because the other hemisphere has to take over some of those functions, that there's a decrement across the board.
For efficiency overall.
Yeah. Yes, they can function. But they tend not to have likely achieved their true potential had they had a full brain, both sides. Next slide. So here's another way to look at it. Input perception in the back, output and action in the front. Known, or what you know already, and parts in your left hemisphere, versus novelty, new things, and more big picture kinds of things in the right hemisphere. And then executor volition, that's that frontal lobe, that's doing things and adjusting to the environment. And routine and automatic, more cerebellar. So these are our three axes of interpretation. So let's move on, and we can talk about some of the neuroscience of reading, math, writing, and psychopathology, a brief overview. So again, this is way too complex to get into in details, but what I'm trying to share with you in presenting these slides is that reading is not just one thing. And you have some people, especially in that RTI camp, who say, oh, it's all phonological and it's all downstream from there. And but it's clearly not. When you look at different studies and look, one of the things that you guys should think about if you become consumers of research is most studies out there that are drawing conclusions about brain functioning are doing so on the basis of typical learners. And the problem is, at least in my career, I don't spend a lot of time with typical learners. I mean, I have done RTI studies, multi-tiered system of support studies, where we address the whole kids in the school, every kid in the school. But there's many different causes of reading disability, math disability, writing disability. And so it gives you some of the ideas here. Obviously there's phonological in the superior temporal lobe, orthographic in the occipital lobe, and the visual word form area in the occipital temporal kind of vague area there. And then sound symbol association in the parietal lobe. All those can be causes of disability. And that's known as your dorsal stream for reading. So decoding is what's known as the dorsal stream. And the word dorsal didn't come out, but that black arrow pointing up means it's the dorsal stream. You also have oculomotor for tracking. Some kids, I mean, there's so many things you can learn from kids just by asking them. Why do you have problems with reading? The letters jump around now. You know, I can't keep track of what I'm doing. I'm a really slow reader, so I can't understand what I'm reading because the letters are jumping around or the words are jumping around. And it's a very rare cause, but it does exist. There are kids who have it. I've worked with kids who've had an oculomotor problem. That's the visual eye fields. That's supposed to be a railroad track up there. So that's just basic reading decoding. Let's go on to the next slide.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Brad, in terms of severity of reading disability, like a severe dyslexia where someone's giving, providing Orton Gillingham instruction or Lindemood Bell, and you're not getting a response to treatment. When you see non-responders to treatments like that, and you look at those, those areas of the brain involved with reading, what's your reasoning for why it's a non-responder? Is it because there's so many severe localized areas involved in reading that aren't working, that it makes it so severe? Or how do
Well, you brought up a couple of good points. One is, I forgot to mention this when we started because I'm trying to rush, there's never enough time to present all this stuff. Oh my God, it's 7:19. One is there could be more than one thing. Like Virginia Berninger at the University of Washington talks about the triple word form theory of dyslexia. So the more things you add, or like a double deficit, you've heard there's decoding and then there's rapid automatic naming. Maybe you've heard of both of those. And then you add a working memory problem on top of that. Yeah, I mean, and then you look at compensation. Some kids compensate, which undermines their ability to develop these areas. And so, yeah, that's one reason. Or it could be very severe in one area. More often than not, a very severe dyslexia that is caused by just one thing is usually phonological. So that's the most common reason, phonological awareness. And, also phonics is a great way to teach them. But I want to bring this, I'm glad you brought that up because there's another thing I want to mention. Things aren't really localized in the brain. I localize them on your slides to try to teach you about the differences, but they're all kind of interconnected. So the last thing we want to think of is there's a lesion in the superior temporal lobe, so they can't do phonics or whatever. Because as you pointed out, with split brain patients and patients who had hemispherectomies, they still can learn to use, to do those skills, even if that area of the brain's missing. So that's an excellent question and point, Howard. But I do want to share for you the difference between the dorsal stream and the ventral stream, because this is pretty important. If you learn anything from this talk, it's the difference between the dorsal stream and the ventral stream. The dorsal stream is, like I said, for decoding, okay? Nonsense words are a great task to look at whether the kid has that phoneme grapheme correspondence skills. So if you look at that word, ulg, that's not a word, but to look at those letters, U-L-G, and say it's ulg or yulg, ulg is probably the better because of the three letters. And what you do when you use that dorsal stream to decode nonsense words and decode words you don't know is Broca's area often gets involved. It's actually an articulatory function of Broca's area, which is in the frontal lobes. So here's another little thing to look for in your clinical practice. You ever see kids read where their lips are moving silently? They're actually using that front part of the brain to try to correct for that difficulty with sound symbol association, which is the most common cause of what we traditionally call dyslexia. But the ventral stream is an automatic stream into the temporal lobe. You see that's blue down there for reading whole words. And so in education, you probably have been in classes, some of you they've said, oh, it's a debate. Do we teach decoding, or do we phonics, or do we teach a sight word approach? No, you need both. And you won't succeed if you don't have both. And I've experienced and worked with kids who didn't have one stream functioning very well and the other one functioning very well. And none of them turn out to be good readers. I'll explain why in a minute. But think about this for a minute. So you have the top stream, the dorsal stream, that is going out to sounding out and decoding words that you don't know. But the way you want to read is sight word approach, right? Because going down fast, that's the fast drop. That's what leads to reading fluency, right? We don't decode the words we know. We see them and we automatically say stream. We don't sit there and go stream. We say stream because we've seen that word before. And so now it's automatic. So most of our reading is sight word approach. So you say, well, why don't you teach sight word approach to start with? I'll give you a good example a little later. Next slide. So, like I said, the ventral stream is more for that kind of processing words by objects. You know, the actual, you know, you don't sit there and go word in the ventral stream, you go word. I know that word. And so that's what makes a fluent reader, is being able to recognize words by sight. And you rely on your knowledge of vocabulary. That's another cause of reading disability. Obviously, language comprehension and language expression, as well as working memory in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex to kind of keep track of what you're reading. You can have some kids who just do that dorsal stream reading, or even ventral stream reading, where they read like the wind. Hyperlexics is a good example. And they don't understand squat about what they're reading. So, you know, I mean, there's many different causes of reading disability. And again, I've kind of combined fluency and comprehension, whereas in a full presentation, I sort those out for you. So next slide, we'll talk about math now. A lot of stuff in math. You know, one of the things that's people might be surprised to hear is that when you look at Geary's work and other people who have done epidemiological studies, math disabilities are just as common as reading disabilities. They just don't get the attention they deserve. There's a lot of brain areas, and they're very similar to reading, but you do have more spatial and nonverbal kinds of characteristics that affect reading. Matter of fact, like estimation. Think about it. Your right hemisphere is into the novelty, right? So when you estimate a mathematical response, it's more right brain versus the exact answer, which is more left brain. And then you have, again, more motor coordination for handwriting, math computation steps. Again, we miss all this skill development when we give kids calculators and math facts tables. And then they end up in high school learning disabled in math. And I can't help but think some of these kids I have evaluated probably never had a math disability, but because of the way they were instructed, we developed a math disability. And that's that thing about brain plasticity. It's not always positive. You can take a good brain and make it bad. And a great example in psychopathology is PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. You put a kid, a normal brain kid, in a stressful and chaotic and unpredictable and sometimes violent or aggressive environment, their brain gets hardwired towards dysfunction. And so we can do the same thing in reading and math if we're not careful. Next slide.
Brad, just being able to teach, you know, if you're teaching teachers at a university, I taught learning disabilities at the University of British Columbia, to be able to teach, you know, if you're teaching the math curriculum for elementary school and you're just going through curriculum, but you don't teach the structure of the brain and the systems involved in learning and understanding math facts or math problem solving, I think a teacher's left with just a lack of insight into the individual differences of children they're going to have. And I think that's why, you know, you're showing that slide, the previous slide, is, you know, teachers need to be able to explain to children the complexities of learning math. And if you're struggling, there's probably a reason, and it's not because you're dumb.
Or you're not trying.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I, like I said earlier when I was talking about teacher issues, teachers want to know this stuff, but unfortunately they're not exposed to it.
Yeah, so I wanted to bring it back to that because I mean that's the purpose of your life has always been not just teaching us, but so teachers can teach children about the complexities of learning math.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that, like I said, when people ask me to do an hour talk to cover everything, I'm going like, even 2 hours to just talk about what we're talking about today is way too fast and way too limited. But I'm also not gonna dumb things down because we don't have enough time or whatever. I mean, we expose it to you, and then you learn about it and you read about it and you grow and develop. I mean, just Google brain and math. Guess what? Go to Google Scholar and just spend. Here's an exercise for you practitioners out there. Just spend 15 minutes a day Googling, go to Google Scholar and, ADHD and brain. And, you'll be shocked at how many dozens or maybe even hundreds of articles out there that have really explored some of these connections. You talked about white matter connectivity in learning disabilities and ADHD. Pretty clear that that's part of the problem. One of the things that we should highlight and target in terms of improving these academic skills. So when it comes to math fluency and math word problems, oh my gosh, now you got every area of the brain involved, because now you got the language system involved, and the language system has to translate the words into equations, and then you have to calculate it, and then you have to spit it back out in words. So any kid who's got a white matter problem about connecting all those different areas is really going to struggle with math word problems. Unlike reading, there is some right hemisphere activity in reading, depending on the type of reading. If it's like reading poetry, there's a lot of right hemisphere activity. If it's only like reading about, a factual story or a narrative or something like that, then not much right hemisphere activity. But with math word problems, there's lots of reasons why a kid can have problems with math and struggle. And so it's always good to compare how they do in calculation versus how they do in math word problems. Fluid reasoning, for instance, is a very strong indicator of the ability to do math word problems. But it's another thing we need to look at in our tests for you psychologists out in the audience. You got to look at the cause or the breakdown of the learning that's going on, because obviously working memory then plays a big role when you're doing these translations as well. So anyway, math word problems is definitely the hardest thing you can do. But also look on your test, because not all of the items are math word problems. So you're always looking for those individual patterns in kids that can help you to learn how to teach them. Next slide. Okay, so here's a little quiz show. Here's your answer. This academic subject requires the exact same constructs included in most executive function definitions. What is it? You guys should know. What is written expression, of course? When you think about it, how do we define executive functions? The ability to plan, organize, carry out, monitor, evaluate, and change your written response. So any kid with executive function problems typically has some sort of written expression problem. And if they don't, then you need to think about that. But written expression, it's so complex, I don't even try to kind of, what I've done here on the next slide, let's go to the next slide. It's just kind of highlight for you, and I really don't want to take the time to go into detail, but look at all the brain areas involved in written expression. Written expression by far is the most difficult academic subject, by far. And so you get all kinds of kids with all kinds of reasons for problems with writing. And a lot of them tend to be frontal. So, because the brain boss is the one that does all these steps in writing. So there's a lot of things to consider. Again, you'll have these handouts at the end of the presentation that you can kind of go through in detail, but it gives you an idea. It also gives you an idea of the different types of writing a little bit, like, you know, if you're writing about, you know, who was Leif Erikson, you know, and it's just straightforward kind of reporting of a historical figure and what they did. You know, that's more left brain. But writing poetry, for instance, or writing metaphors or sarcasm or humor, more right brain in orientation. So again, back of the brain, front of the brain, left, right, we've got all 4 quadrants really tapped in written expression.
One of the things, Brad, that we're planning to do is, so the people who are here listening, we may take a topic like written expression and just do one webinar on it down the road. So those who are interested, we'll let you know if we get our special guest, Dr. Hale, to do a webinar just on dyslexia, or just on ADHD, the neuroscience of it, the brain literacy of it.
Yeah, we would have no problem filling up a whole lecture on written expression, that's for sure. Next time I'm going to share with you a written expression sample, which you can learn a lot just by looking at what they have. Oh, we got a message down there. Am I supposed to monitor those messages, or?
No, I got it.
Okay. Is it something we need to address?
It's a thumbs up to having more specific talks, I think.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah.
So now we switch gears a little bit. We're moving away from academics to psychosocial functioning. And the one thing I want to point out to you guys to think about here is, you know, we were at a place when I first started, you know, with training and practice, where almost no one knew about executive functions. Now people know about executive functions, but they don't think about the different types of executive functions. So, you know, there's at least 5 circuits in the brain that do different things. So for instance, like the cingulate, if you got a kid with cingulate dysfunction, guess what they have a hard time doing? Making decisions, keeping track of stuff, doing things quickly. You know, a lot of indecision. You know, there's a lot of behaviors that, you know, are related to these frontal subcortical circuits, which includes the basal ganglion, thalamus, and as well as the cerebellum. And there's a big difference.
Brad, is that the same as the saliency network? You know, are these the same kind of circuits you're talking about? The default mode network, all those kind of things?
Yeah, it's a way to look at it. But there's a big difference between what we call dorsolateral function and orbital function. Dorsolateral, which is right up here, okay, is about doing things in the world. Like written expression is a dorsolateral largely function. Solving a task, completing a group activity, and so forth. But orbital is all about controlling your own emotions and behavior. So there's really a big difference between those 2 circuitries, because you can have a person who is cognitively has good executive functions, but poor emotional executive functions. A good example is conduct disorder or bipolar disorder. Both of those are typically orbital, more orbital types of problems. So another thing to think about here too is an emotional behavioral problem could be more cognitive, or it's more likely to be emotional due to the orbital circuit. And you need to kind of separate those out in your clinical mind so that you're thinking about, because when you go emotional, you probably have seen some of these kids, especially if you deal with the elementary age or preschool, where they just get so emotionally dysregulated that they can't even think logically. And so all you can do is try to de-escalate, you know, trying to talk them out of it, you know, get it together, you can do this, you know, and they're just like, they're not there because they're so wrapped up in that orbital dysfunction. Anyway, next slide. Now, this is what I've been trying to do in my last years as a professor, and I continue to do now that I'm in private practice and running the Center for Teaching Brain Literacy, is we can't have all these different disorders and just say they all have executive dysfunction. You know, attention disorders, guess what? Every single psychopathology has an attention problem. They're not all ADD, okay? And so trying to separate out, because these circuits work as balances and checks and balances to each other. So if one circuit is dysfunctional, so another one can be hyperfunction, which is a great example is anxiety disorder with depression. You know, anxiety disorder is actually too much orbital function and amygdala function. And although the orbital fluctuates based on the amygdala. And then depression, too little functioning. So I came up with this idea that the problem is these cool and hot executive circuits, cool meaning more cognitive, hot meaning more emotional, are kind of working against or with each other. But if one gets dysfunctional, then the other one gets out of balance, making the dysfunction even greater. You know, another example is the kid with ADHD who also has conduct disorder or oppositional defiant disorder, which are very similar neurologically, neuropsychologically. Although there's certainly environmental causes of oppositional defiant disorder. Sorry to offend anyone. But again, it doesn't do us much good to say it's either brain or it's environment, because they're influencing each other. The environment's changing the brain's changing the environment, back and forth. So it's better to think about them together, always, with all kids. Next slide. So just to take balance theory a bit forward, you know, if your right hemisphere is average and your left hemisphere is low, you're probably a little shy and dysphoric, but nothing big. If it's low in the right hemisphere and average in the other, you might be a little outgoing and whimsical. If it's high and low, though, withdrawn and depressed, and low and high for those two hemispheres, hypersocial and manic. Now, I must admit, this is more theory than practice at this point. So I do want you to take this with a grain of salt. But one thing that's very clear is we have at least 5 frontal subcortical circuits. They are impaired or not impaired based on the type of disorder they have. And so we've got to try to sort through this instead of just saying, oh, they're depressed, they have executive dysfunction. Oh, they're ADHD, they have executive dysfunction. Oh, they're schizophrenic, they have ADHD. You know, they're autistic, so they have executive dysfunction. I mean, that doesn't do us any good. We got to figure out what type of executive dysfunction so that we can serve their needs and help them overcome it using brain plasticity, if possible. And I don't want you to get the idea that I think all disability can be erased if we knew what the heck we were doing out there. I think that's not true, but we could at least mitigate or reduce the negative impact if we paid more attention to individual differences in executive function.
Brett, are psychiatrists or psychologists paying attention to any of this in their diagnosis and treatment, or they're just looking at behavior and looking at?
I'm always shocked on the peds neuropsych listserv when people seem very comfortable reverting to non-neurological or neuropsychological causes completely. So, I mean, they just spout out the behavioral. I mean, a great example is autism, which you guys might be shocked to learn, but neuroscience tells us autism is different than Asperger's. I'll be glad to share the articles with you. And we're talking meta-analyses of these different conditions. Well, why did it become a spectrum? Because people like the ADOS, which is a behavior observation approach. And I like the ADOS. I think it gives you good information. But boy, that's not diagnostic of autism versus Asperger's. They need to do that research. And there are even the powers that be in autism, They're not getting rid of the spectrum. They're saying we need to look at subtypes, you know. So anyway, just a simple example for kids with autism, no matter how bright they are. And I've evaluated kids with a 130 visual spatial index who has terrible autism. And that's true autism. Why? Because block design, if you guys know the Wechsler intelligence scales, the manipulating blocks according to a picture, it's often the highest score in autism. It's often the lowest score in Asperger's. So it's just another simple example of how you can kind of start to separate these people out, because they have different social skills needs and requirements. And they should just like with reading, we shouldn't just assume that a kid is on the spectrum, so give them all the same social skills program. We need to individualize based on cognitive strengths and weaknesses, in my opinion. But I'm not in the majority there still. But it's interesting to see the science coming back to support the need to look at these as not just intelligence is the only difference on the spectrum, which is not the case. Next slide. So I'd like to wrap up and then we'll have time for questions and answers. I'm sorry this is so fast. I usually run into problems in my talks of like still having 50 slides left with 10 minutes left in the session.
We kept you on track. We kept you on track.
Yeah, so I've been a taskmaster today for once. But I want to kind of highlight for you what might be confusing to the average school-based or clinic-based practitioner, but makes total sense from a neuroscience perspective, and how neuroscience can really help inform our clinical practices. And next time, that is the entire lecture. I mean, and we're going to hear a lot about how we change brain function and how to do it and how to succeed in doing it so that kids have the optimal chance to succeed in life. So let's go to the next slide. Mark's reading problem. What happened to Mark's reading performance? So we look at the first one, and this is what his score, they were concerned about his reading in first grade, so they did an evaluation. And the psychologist at the time said, well, you know, there's word reading's average, reading fluency, it's average, and reading comprehension average, it's just average. Well, we can't do that pseudo word decoding. Well, maybe he didn't like it or he didn't try or whatever, but they just kind of dismissed it. You don't need pseudo word decoding, do you, in school? So everybody was fine until he was failing everything in 5th grade. And this was his scores in 5th grade. Now word reading went from a 93 to a 72. Pseudo word is still low. And reading fluency dropped quite a bit. And then reading comprehension dropped a ton. Now what happened, and what was interesting is to hear the team around the table go like, well, I think the parents are having some struggles. They might be getting divorced. And I think he just hates reading and he just didn't try. And, you know, they're coming up with all these environmental explanations. Well, neuroscience explains exactly what happened with Mark. And let's talk about that. Next slide. So when you do word attack skills and you don't know what the word dog is, you have to sound it out. And like I said, that's the dorsal stream. You've got the phonology in the superior temporal lobe, and you've got the orthography in the occipital lobe, occipital temporal bridge, and then you connect them in your angular gyrus, DOG, and then you connect that to your comprehension of that word, which is a 4-legged domestic mammal with, I can't even read my own name, with long snout, acute smell, and a barking voice. So, you know, the teacher says, read the word dog. If you don't know that by sight, you have to sound it out, right? Like I told you before, that dorsal stream for sounding out words. And that's certainly where phonology and orthography play a big role. Next slide. But once you know that word dog and you've memorized D-O-G as a dog, you're using more of your inferior temporal lobe, that ventral stream, and also automaticity in the cerebellum to automatically see that D-O-G and you go, dog. You don't have to sound it out. None of us sound out most of the words we run into in life, do we? So you might say to yourself, why don't I just teach sight words? I'll explain why. Let's continue on. So Mark's performance in grade 1. Word reading, reading fluency, and comprehension, good, because the number of known words and the number of sight words is comparable, right? So when you look at those first grade readers, it's pretty simple words that you've seen a lot of times. My son, when he was a little guy, and I stopped him, I said, no, you're going to sound these words out, because he memorized a favorite Christmas book, Snowmen at Night. And he almost didn't even look at the words. I mean, he had them just all memorized and boom, 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 boom. And everybody's like, wow, your son's a reader and he's only 4 or something like that. I don't remember how old he was when he was doing this. But I knew he was trying to use a sight word approach with anything. In other words, just recognize the word, memorize that word, and relate it to your definitions in your temporal lobe. Then just boom. Sight word, sight word, sight word, sight word. So, the story is this: a hot day. It is hot. Frog sits on the pad. Frog sits still in the hot sun. So when you give him this in first grade in Mark, this is what he does. Next tab down. It is a hot. Frog sits on a pad. Okay. And next, frog sits still in the hot sun. So of course, the teacher thinks he's a good reader. The psychologist thought he was a good reader. So what if he couldn't do pseudo word decoding? As long as he's recognizing the words and understanding what he reads, because of course he could understand what he reads because he could read fast. And so it didn't task his working memory. It didn't task his phonology. He was just reading words by sight. So what happened? Here's what happens from a neuroscience perspective. Next slide. We're going to talk about the, oops, so we got a little technical problem there. Just go ahead and put them both up. Keep going. Okay, there's a little ordering problem there. Now, ordering or sequencing can be more left parietal, or it can be frontal. In my case, it's probably frontal. As my good friend Edith Kaplan used to say before she passed, she'd say, I'm so frontal, so frontal. I love that woman. She was a character. Anyway, in grade 1, notice the round words are the words known through oral language. And the square words are the ones known through written language, visual, through that ventral stream. Notice in grade 1, the number of words known in your oral language, in other words, what you've been hearing and learning about from talking to people out in the community and so forth, is almost identical to the number of words you recognize by sight, because the lexicon is so small. You don't need to memorize that many words to do well in first grade readers. But look what happens. By the time you're in 5th grade, you know tons more words by ear than by sight. Okay, so guess what? By the time you're in 5th grade, you're starting to do what you've seen. If you work with children, you've seen this. You're starting to guess at words by sight. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, keep going. So this story is a 5th grade story, New Pearls. With its deep white luster, the beauty of a pearl is unparalleled. Yet pearls start out as nothing more than tiny bits of matter. Notice how the words are much less common. Unparalleled. It's a very uncommon word. How often do you see that in print? Not often. So what happens, keep going, is when he reads this, with its deep white lunch, the beauty of a pest is unpleasant. Yet pests start out as nothing more than tiny bits of magic, a grate of sand, etc. So I know you've seen this if you've worked with kids, especially kids who have phonological or phoneme grapheme correspondence problems, where they start guessing at words all the time. And what happened was in first grade, the teachers let him do that. The parents let him guess at words. And I've even heard teachers say that in meetings. If you don't know the word, just guess. But what you're doing is you're reinforcing that ventral stream, that sight word approach to learning. So when you come across the word luster, which you have no sight word memory for, you call it a lunch. Okay? So what you're doing is what the teachers and the parents allowed this kid to do. His brain didn't change. His brain stayed the same. What it did was it didn't develop enough of a sight word vocabulary to keep up with the curriculum, where the lexicon expands into thousands of words. Next slide. Or keep going. Problem is Mark does not know these words: luster, pearl, unparalleled, matter, and grain. If Mark had decoding skills, which he never learned because they said, oh, just use the sight word approach, that's fine. It's you know, some people say you don't need decoding skills. If Mark had the decoding skills, he could potentially read and understand because he may have these words in lexical semantic memory. And that's in your temporal lobe is where most of your lexical semantic memory is. So the meaning of pearl or luster or unparalleled or matter or grain might be in Mark's temporal lobe because he learned those in oral language, but has no way of reading them because the sight word approach doesn't work anymore. So, so he just hasn't seen them enough. So now he can't read. And so nothing really happened to change Mark's brain. And the reason why is because the educators, the psychologists, the parents, and all the other professionals didn't understand why that problem with pseudo word decoding would turn into a significant reading disability later in life. And that's, I think, why we need brain literacy, is to make sure those things don't happen to kids anymore. Okay, next slide. So what do we do when we read? I told you earlier, most of us read by sight because we've memorized the words we need to memorize and we can read off by sight, but you can't always read by sight. So let's give an example of what Mark would have done if he would have had a dorsal stream functioning to be able to decode words. So click the button, please. So with its deep white, and then the kid doesn't, you know, the kid's understanding with its deep white, and they can read those words by sight. But now we come up to luster, and he has no clue. So what does the brain tell him to do? The brain says, next point, next one, go up and sound out luster. And then put it back into your temporal lobe for understanding. So next. Keep going. So in other words, if he doesn't know the word by sight, he can go up to his dorsal stream and sound it out. And then he continues on with other sight words he recognizes. So continue on. The beauty of a pearl and so forth. So what we need to do is we need to read by sight, read by sight, read by sight, read by sight, read by sight. Don't know the word, got to decode it to see if I know what that word means. And then back to sight word reading, sight word reading, sight word reading, sight word reading, and so forth. But the older you get, if you don't have the decoding skills, the more words you're guessing at or skipping. And another good example of looking for this is a difference between a kid's oral reading and silent reading. They'll do much better on silent reading. Why? Because they skip over or guess at the words that they're missing, but they're reading fast enough so their working memory is intact and they can still comprehend. But you ask them to oral read and they're really struggling and they don't remember anything. I mean, so look for these little patterns, for instance. Next point. Oh, that's the end. that's my books. Just trying to sell my books. Next slide. And feel free to contact me. My official name is James Bradford Hale, but I go by Brad, and I'm fine with Brad. My website is www.teachingbrainliteracy.com and email connect@teachingbrainliteracy.com.
They get more of you next week. So they get to see you again, and hopefully we'll create more specialized subject matter workshops as well. But we also have 30 minutes, 30 minutes for any questions. So Sandra, you might want to come on, and people can turn on their videos and audio. And is this, does Zoom have raise a hand options, Sandra, like Teams does, Microsoft Teams?
I believe so, but yet everyone is more than welcome to either write a question. Oh, thank you. Yes, it does, apparently. I see that in the chat. Ask and the answer comes to you right away.
I'm used to Microsoft Teams, so
yeah,
we do that
exactly.
every day. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, but we're open for questions. Absolutely.
It's a lot to cover in a short amount of time. And I do, if you're feeling a little overwhelmed, which a lot of people do in my workshops, you're not alone. Other people feel that too. I thought it important to get out as much as I could in a short amount of time. So I know your time is very valuable. And Howard originally asked me for an hour and a half, and I'm like, no way, I'm gonna do it all in an hour and a half.
But we're so often on Zoom or Teams, I can only handle an hour sometimes. I'm just really impressed that we've done that. We do have a question from Elaine here. Okay. And she writes, I can't comprehend anything I read silently or aloud unless I hear every word in my brain's ear. If I haven't read them, no matter how long or how often I look at the words, I get as much out of them as I would if I were blind or if they were written in a language that I don't read or understand. In other words, nothing. So auditory distractions interfere with my comprehension because those sounds compete with the silent sounds of the words I'm reading. My question is this: is there a way to retrain my brain so that I can get the meaning without having to hear the words in my brain? Because I have to hear every word in my brain's ear. I can only silent read as fast as I talk.
Right. Excellent question. I mean, one of the things that we didn't really get into tonight, again, it was just kind of a simple overview, is what we call difficulty with cross-modal matching. Taking sounds, connecting them to vision, and sometimes they're competing with each other or fighting with each other so that you almost have to ignore one channel. You know, I'd love to say that you can overcome it. When I work with cross-modal matching, I do that. Sounds to letters and sounds to words and words to sounds, and go back and forth is one of the strategies I do. Another thing that we didn't really get into tonight is written spelling. Both oral, you know, somebody says the word and then you write it, or vision and then you write it. And there's different methods you can do to kind of cross-modal those kinds of things so you can start to make those connections.
Someone just wrote, just wonderful, thank you. I agree with and try to put all this into my clinical practice. My struggle is how to communicate this information in a neuropsych report. Perhaps you'll cover this next week. Any suggestions in the written neuropsych report that would go to teachers and parents? And
yeah, a lot of reports, psychological reports, we kind of talk more about tests than we talk about kids. And so when case conceptualization is hard. And so to do that well, you need a lot of experience and training and practice and stuff like that. But I write my reports, I don't write about brain functions, And I include very little about the actual tests, especially in the neuropsych part of the report. I'm just describing strengths and weaknesses. And most people are surprised. They like my neuropsych reports, but they're, oh, you're the brain guy. You must be talking about the parietal, inferior parietal lobe, and, angular gyrus, and, the corpus callosum and all this other. No, I use my understanding of the brain to guide my understanding of the psychological processes, which everybody can understand and describe. So when a neuropsych reads my report, they say, oh, he's talking about the corpus callosum. But there's no corpus callosum in the text, because that's one of the things that happens. We kind of, it's easy to write test reports on the Wechsler intelligence scales, 5th edition, the standardized measure, the mean of, if you look at my reports though, I have appendices, which shows all those scores, okay? So there's always the scores that other people can go back and look at, but they are not, for the most part, in the report. I talk about kids and their function. I had a parent, we got to get to other questions, but I like to give examples. And tonight, unfortunately, we haven't had a lot of examples. But I was in a meeting probably about a month ago, in a team meeting with everybody sitting around the room. And the parent, all of a sudden, midway through my presentation of the results, she said, "Stop, big eyes, stop." And I was like, "Oh, I'm sorry. Can I help you?" Did I say something you didn't understand? Anyway, she said, "I've been in these meetings for over a dozen years, and no one has described my child as accurately as you have today." So when so much of it is case conceptualization. And I think, unfortunately, in some training programs or some practices, it's more about tests and test scores. Talk about the children, learn about the children, understand who the child is, and you will shine in those meetings and in those reports.
Sarah Cohen asked about lexical memory. She said it came up so much in your discussions about reading and math and written language. And she said, I struggle to explain to parents why strengthening lexical memory is so important. How would you explain why it's so key, Brad?
It forms the foundation of all the other processes. I mean, without lexical semantic memory, you can't do math, you can't do reading. I mean, you got to learn vocabulary, you got to learn, and it kind of goes back to some of the things you were talking about earlier. You got to learn math facts. And, we don't like to do that anymore. Give them calculators, give them a cheat sheet, and that's not how the brain works. Like I said, the brain works by learning content and then learning procedure.
I remember with my severe dyslexia, there wasn't a lot of reading going on in elementary school for me, or even high school. And so in university, I started reading Russian literature and English literature. And one of my first jobs was a dishwasher at Carlos and Bud's Tex-Mex restaurant in Vancouver. And I was the dishwasher, and all the English lit majors were the front cooks. And they would have these discussions, and I said, I don't know what they're saying. I don't know these words. And here I was, a psychology student in university, but I hadn't read a lot. And so I began to realize at age 19 how important vocabulary was. And I needed to train my brain to know what these words mean. And because there was a huge gap that I was going to suffer if I didn't. So you can imagine all the other kids with dyslexia who aren't readers, who may not have great auditory memory, who have this low language base of vocabulary, right?
Right. And same thing with math. I mean, math is a very hierarchical thing. So, if you don't have down those basic number sets, quantity, symbol relationships, and being able to pull upon those to do more complex math, it's going to be a struggle. So again, it's, and you hear a lot about this. Well, we teach them multiple ways of doing things, and that's going to build that. And it is going to build in some sense, but it's not a replacement for developing the basic lexical semantic skills that are so important for reading, writing, math.
I know that, you know, when I was trained with Orton Gillingham by Dana King in her school, at the Kildonan School, they used, you know, workbook series like Worldly Wise, would teach prefixes and suffixes, Latin root words, and you begin to understand why they're doing. They just didn't teach decoding in the Orton Gillingham methodology. They taught lexical knowledge and a ton of it as a tutor training kids.
Well, and that's good too, but you know, the problem is we tend to throw the baby out with the bathwater in education. You know, whatever's the latest trend or the most popular thing, and we throw the science away. Like I said, even if you don't get into neuroscience of education at all, look at John Hattie's visible learning. That tells you what practices work in the classroom. It's based on hundreds and hundreds of studies. John Hattie, Hattie. And every teacher should have that book on their desk.
I have a question from Carrie, Brad. I'm very interested in further information regarding the different kinds of executive functioning and what assessment tools to use to help us differentiate them and explain the impact upon learning. Is this a potential special session? I think we talked about we should do one just on executive functioning and have that.
Yeah. Matter of fact, I'm talking with a test publisher right now about constructing an orbital battery. We have a lot of good tests to look at dorsolateral functioning or problem solving, things like the Wisconsin card sort test or the category test, or, you know, there's just a whole bunch of them out there that are really good, you know, your CPTs and so forth. But we need a motion regulation test and theory of the mind. One of the things that orbital cortex does is it understands the perspective of others. And one of the things that balance theory shows us is that it's not always a deficit model. Sometimes it's an excess. Mm-hmm. Like a deficit in the ability to take the perspective of others, no empathy, right? Mm-hmm. Conduct disorder, yeah, bad. But what is it to have too much empathy? Is that bad too? Yes, it leads to codependency, right? Where whatever your partner is experiencing, your mood is changed completely by your partner. So, you know, when it comes to executive functions, it's not just a more is better. OCD is a good example of more is not better, you know, when it comes to executive functions. So
a question from Macy. Thank you for presenting on this. Exclamation mark. I'm currently a teacher interested in the field of educational neuroscience. I would like to start learning more now as a teacher and later transition into career more focused in this area. Could you recommend future steps for me, both big and small, anything from read this book to go to this graduate school, smiley face?
Thanks. It's really a nascent field, which means it's just starting. You know, again, you get there's mostly graduate programs right now. So undergrad programs, they still, Calgary was one of the few places that had an undergraduate lecture hall full of teachers who said, why haven't we been learning this all along?
Hey, Brad, you know, I pulled out a 2014 March 8th review of you as a teacher in your Education 445 class. And this person said, a brilliant man, I don't want to boost your confidence, who's passionate about his subject area and truly wants his students to learn. He was carrying the student had a bio degree, so he really enjoyed the class because he had some foundation in biological sciences. But it may be a shock to those without a science background, meaning your course was tough. You must attend lectures, but the quizzes and assignments are fair. A refreshingly different class in the education program. You will learn a lot. So, you know, teachers want this stuff.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, they do.
Mm-hmm. But here's a bit of the problem. Be careful. I mean, if you go to my website, and I'm not trying to brag, but thank you for those kind words that the student said for me. But have the people who are arguing for brain-based education or neuroeducation, as they sometimes refer to, do they have the credentials? Do they have the background? Have they done the research? Do they have the licensure? Do they have, you know, I was a tenured full professor of educational neuroscience. So that usually means that you've done something right.
Mhm.
A couple of things.
I have to plug, I would highly recommend, she's a pioneer in educational neuroscience. We'll talk a bit more about her next week. Brad's met her. Barbara Arrowsmith Young wrote a book, The Woman Who Changed Her Brain. It's a fascinating read. She has a very remarkable insight into neuroscience and brain change. Norman Doidge's book, The Brain That Changes Itself, is a fascinating read as well. Brad, do you know a few other books that you've liked? There's books on executive functioning that are pretty, standard ones that one should read.
You know what? I'm trying to think of. So you get old and then you have problems with retrieval. From long-term memory. I'm blanking on the author's name, and he's a very famous neuroscientist. But the book is called Cognitive Neuroscience. Maybe you could Google it. It's in like its 10th edition, but it's super user-friendly, it's written at kind of an undergrad level, but it has lots of nice pictures and examples of experience. Who am I thinking of?
Anyone who's out there who has Google it for us and put it in the chat. But let me go to the next question from Catherine. What neuropsych academic tests do you recommend that are most useful in diagnosing LDs and differentiating between the different facets of LD functions that guide intervention, especially when you may have to be selective about what tests to purchase?
Yeah, excellent question. Gazzaniga, of course. Posner's, yeah, Gazzaniga. And Cognitive Neuroscience, it's probably in its 40th edition now. But an excellent user-friendly book. I don't recommend neuropsych books when you're just starting out because they'll overwhelm you. We neuropsych people tend to talk a bunch of gibberish. We call the basal ganglia like 10 different things. Posner, I can see, has a good book out there. Colbin Wishaw was my intro in graduate school, but there's a lot of good books out there now. But be careful. My point was earlier, be careful for people who are in education, who are touting a brain-based course, or they're going to give a workshop, a full-day workshop on brain-based learning, and see if they have those credentials in their resume or their curriculum vitae. Because what often happens is they'll pick up a book and the book may be wrong about stuff, and then they go and they teach what's called neuromyths, things that are no longer accurate in reflecting how the brain works. Like the left brain is verbal and the right brain is nonverbal. That's wrong. So, and yet I run into people all the time who, and you can look at my journal article in the Journal of the International Neuropsychological Society. If you go to my website, it's on there, so you can have a look. But it's very clear that language is bilateral, nonverbal skills are bilateral. And so you have to be real careful when, there's a lot of excitement for educators to try to learn about the brain to better help their kids, but they can be sometimes filled with misinformation.
So Catherine's come back to us. She wants you to get to what psychological assessments and tests did you enjoy using for differentiating and LDs and those kind of things?
Well, I usually start out with either a WISC, a DOSC, or a KBC. As I do a full history, I do behavior ratings, I do achievement testing, some sort of cognitive test. And then what I do is I generate hypotheses. We'll talk about this next week, the cognitive hypothesis testing model. And it's basically, if you're a neuropsychologist, it's a flexible battery approach where you try to sort out what the problem is. So, the kid has a handwriting problem, messy handwriting. Is it visual spatial? Is it visual directional? Is it motor? Is it visual motor integration? Or is it automaticity of the cerebellar system? So you pick neuropsych tests. Like, for instance, if I want to know if it's spatial, I give like arrows on the NEPSI, or judgment aligned orientation. And that test has no motor skills. So you're taking away the motor and you're looking just at visual spatial skills. And if that's fine, then you know it's unlikely that it's visual spatial. So that's where you kind of get into, and again, I didn't give you the kind of detail about brain functioning today that you really need to go to that next level. But it's certainly possible, and I taught my students that when they were training under me in neuropsychology. But part of it is just learning what you can about brain functioning and then looking for it in the classroom or in your test situations. One of the things I told my students to do is, I want to see your protocols when you're given a WISC or a KBC or a DOS or whatever. I want to see, or I even use the CAS now and again, don't mean to diss Jack Naglieri.
How about the Woodcock-Johnson? Is that,
you know, there's certain things about the Woodcock-Johnson I like, and I know the authors of it, and I like them quite a bit. I never do it as a standalone just because some of the tasks really bother me. Like the passage comprehension task is a simple sentence with a word missing. Okay. Well, guess what? Yes, it requires lexical semantic knowledge and vocabulary knowledge and that, but it also is sensitive to retrieval, right? Because if you can't retrieve that correct word from your memory to fill in the blank in the sentence, then it can send you in thinking that they have a reading comprehension problem.
The gray oral or something for more comprehensive.
Exactly. So no tests, all tests have pros and cons. If you wanted to ask me about the WISC, I'd tell you the problems I have with the WISC. Although it's a much better test.
Does sometimes a child leads you to a battery?
Yes, exactly. And so I don't favor one over the other. I like the WJ for some of the subtests are really good and meaningful. One of the problems with CHC, so the Woodcock-Johnson's is based on CHC, and there's a couple of problems I have with that. CHC stands for Cattell-Horn-Carroll, but they're all based on Cattell-Horn-Carroll now. All of them include those factors at one level or another. But the problem is CHC went to a place where they came up with, I don't know how many they're at now, but 97 unique abilities underneath the 7 factors, CHC factors. And so it's almost like, you know, they're teaching clinicians to find the smoking gun of the 97, which is going to be low. And that's the cause of the disability. But the brain doesn't work that way. It doesn't, you know, work as 97 individual components. They're all systems and they're all related to each other.
Hey Brad, we have like 8 minutes here.
Okay.
I'm going to throw this out at you for maybe we talk about it more next week. But you know, when I was doing psychiatric,
let me mention one more thing to address that last person's question. I always like to give a measure of memory, a measure of new learning. So I often use the TOML, Cecil Reynolds test. I like the TOML too. The new RAML's out. That's good, probably good too. I haven't seen it. And I also like to use a lot of the tests on the NEPSI. Not that they're the only ones, but those are 2. And then I usually, if there's a motor issue, I'll go to a groove pegboard or something like that. So and then there's a bunch of different executive tests that I use. But I wanted to answer that person's question a little bit more clearly. Go ahead, Howard.
Great, thanks, Brad. I used to do psychiatric assessments with psychologists, and you know, the standard was, you know, the WISC and or some measure of cognition, and, you know, get some cognitive tests, some achievement, look for discrepancy models and all. And then we write up, you know, recommendations, and a lot of them were strategies and compensations for those cognitive weaknesses. And then all of a sudden I came along to the Arrowsmith program, Barbara's work, saying, hey, you can actually improve cognitive dysfunctions. You don't have to compensate and strategize. And we now know that it may be that all this compensation and strategy is making the brain overwork and make it somewhat more possible dysfunctional, which you alluded to, right? So, right. You know, it's interesting where we're going with this field and what recommendations based on the science of the brain development and potential negative impact of strategy and compensation. and we'll talk about this more next week, but I thought you might want some closing words to maybe entice them to come back next week, maybe invite a friend to join us, because we can send the recording of this session and her friend can join next week. But what's your thoughts on this? Like, obviously, not every school is going to have, cognitive remediation programs in place. So strategies and compensations are like lifelines for a lot of these kids, but we also know it's a problem neurologically.
Yeah. By allowing, by using, when I went through neuropsych training, I'm an old guy. That's what we did. We found the hole in the brain, and then we said, how do we get around it? It's basically what they told us to do. Even on my comprehensive exams, that's what we had to do. We had to figure out what the pathology was and then make recommendations to get around it. But that is really, or teaching to strengths, right? Oh, they have a strength in this, so teach to that.
Absolutely.
And what you're doing is you're making the strengths stronger, what we know about neuroplasticity, and you're making the weaknesses weaker. And so, in my paper I wrote in Trends in Neuroscience and Education, which I'm very proud of. It was the only publication I ever had where I never had any revisions on it. So I worked really hard on that paper. But we really argue that we could inadvertently be causing more severe disability by ignoring the weaknesses and instead teaching the strengths. It's really based on an outdated model of brain functioning it's what I went through, find the lesion and figure out what to do to get around it.
Yeah. So next week, we're going to talk about how to actually, work on some of these cognitive capacities, improve functioning. This idea of intervention and neuroplasticity is going to be a focus next week. And I just want to thank you, Brad, for being with us, your wealth of knowledge. I think everyone absolutely enjoyed your talk. You can sit back tonight in Bellingham, enjoy a cup of nice hot chocolate as the rain drops on your roof. But you're an exceptional guy, and I'm just grateful that you could do this with us. And I look forward to next week with you, Brad.
Absolutely.
Well, I'm honored to be here. And you guys are an amazing group, and we, of course, we don't always see things exactly the same, but that's okay. At least what we're trying to do is get the conversation going in education. We need to get past it. And I know it's hard for people because they have whole faculties of education where not a single person knows anything about the brain.
Yep.
And that's frankly what their job is, but it's just been ignored in education for so long. Oh, that's not relevant for us.
Yeah.
And even unfortunately with neuropsychology, we run into this too, where neuropsychologists say, well, we don't want to teach them, or we want to be the specialists that come in and fix everything.
And it makes it so difficult for families too, because they're starting to come to this on their own. The people I speak with are saying, I think I might be inadvertently exacerbating what's going on by supporting and becoming this person's brain for them, et cetera, et cetera. So they know this inherently, that there's another way, but this kind of a presentation, this knowledge is exactly what they need, everyone needs. So I thank you just on behalf of all of them.
Yeah. So
thank you.
Thanks, Brad. You take it easy. Everyone have
we'll see you guys next week, where we're going to be talking all about assessment.
Tell others to join. We can send the first session to them. So tell friends to join. And we're going to do more of these, Brad. We're going to make 100 sessions over time.
Have a great evening, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate it.